Today I have the great pleasure of getting to meet somebody new. She's a person I actually know of more than I know, but I got an introduction from Andrew Benson. Her name's Geeta Dayal, and she is a writer extraordinaire for all the things I give a crap about. So there's an introduction for you. She has written about a bazillion articles, so many of them about experimental music, music history, electronic music in a lot of different kinds of venues and stuff like that. I recently taught a class at St. Olaf University. I was surprised at how many times it was her articles that I used to introduce people to different kinds of work. So I'm very excited to talk to Geeta, and with that, I will just shut up and say hi. Hey, how's it going?
Going okay. How are you?
I'm all right. I am so excited to get a chance to talk to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a chat.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So I kind of blurted out a quick introduction about your work, but why don't I have you describe a little bit about your work?
Okay. Well, for almost 20 years now, I've been working professionally as a journalist and critic, specializing, as you said, in experimental music and the history of electronic sound. Those aren't the only things that I've written about. I've also written pretty extensively on technology and I've written quite a bit about visual art. I've written about brain science. But all of these things sort of interleave and are very interwoven with experimental and electronic music. So I've always been very fascinated by music and what we can learn from music. So it still fascinates me to this day. And I'm also very committed to the idea of writing and writing well, which is always a challenge. So it's not just about conveying information. It's about writing it in a way that's really compelling and also doing deep research. That's another hallmark of my work, is that everything is very deeply researched. I do lots of interviews. I do a lot of delving into archival and weird primary sources, strange books and rare sources, source materials. So I'm really doing a lot of legwork so that I can be an authoritative voice on this stuff. There aren't many critics left like me who do this full time, so it's becoming more and more difficult, I would say, to be a critic in America and to be a journalist, especially one that specializes in the arts, because the arts in America, I would say, are under threat in a lot of ways, not only because of our current political situation, but also because of the way that the economics have turned over the last 15 years, and that those shifts that have happened with newspapers and magazines and with so much reading being focused online, and the fact that business models haven't really evolved yet to the point where writers are getting paid and supported fairly for their work. So that's all still up to question. I wonder if in 20 years, people like myself will continue to be able to do what we do. So there's that as well. Obviously the interest in the work is what sustains me. And I love music and I love thinking about music, but I think we should also talk about how this kind of work can be sustained so that people like myself aren't just historical anomalies in a way, that we don't just vanish, which could happen
Right.
in the near future.
Yeah, well, that's actually a pretty powerful point, and it almost in a way goes back to your discussion about the deep research you do. One of the reasons I think that I liked using your articles for teaching purposes is that it was clear that was not off the cuff work. You weren't just doing stuff out of memory or whatever. You were putting together a well researched body of work, and one that could be trusted. And clearly the reason is because you weren't just doing things on the fly. You were doing deeply researched work on even the most basic of articles. This is really critical for establishing a real history of this kind of stuff. And I don't think that there are enough people doing that level of historical work on electronic and experimental music.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think there are, especially not people who work within the media. There are some who work within the academy and mostly talk with other people in the academy. But that's a very cloistered world in a lot of ways. There are a few of those people that are what I would think of as public intellectuals who do convey their work to a larger audience. But for the most part, it's really up to journalists and critics to explain to the public why this stuff matters. Experimental musicians aren't always so good at explaining their work themselves.
That's true.
They're too busy making the work. And sometimes they're very articulate writers, like John Cage was a really good writer who wrote voluminous quantities of essays and, pieces about his work. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, another person who wrote many well-written essays explaining what he was doing while he was doing it, which is enormously helpful to look back at. But then there are many other composers who never did that, and the documentation of their work is much less. So you have to do a lot more digging to piece together their work and their life story. There's a mystery about it that's very interesting to me. As a kid, I was always into mystery novels. I always liked puzzles. I always liked trying to solve difficult problems. I went to engineering school. I went to college at MIT. I studied science and engineering, and a lot of science and engineering is about trying to solve problems, breaking down bigger problems into smaller problems, and having an analytical approach to everything you do. And so that served me well in writing because I'm looking at it also like a scientist and an engineer. I'm more technically savvy maybe than some other writers are, but at the same time, I don't try to get bogged down in like discussions of gear and things like that. Because at the end of the day, it's people using the gear. The gear isn't making the music itself, right?
Yeah, right.
It's the people using it. And the more you get bogged down into model numbers of synthesizers and stuff like that, I mean, I'm not saying it isn't important to learn about that stuff, and there were certainly various inventors that were incredibly significant people who really shaped the course of music history. But, I try to always focus on the people first and how they use these technologies for their artistic goals, how they used or maybe misused technology in interesting ways. So I think that electronic music and experimental music is a great way to understand the world at large. It's not a rarefied thing. This is what a lot of people don't get. They're like, oh, you write about this fringy music. It's so out there, this kind of stuff. I'm like, no, it's not out there. I mean, the story of electronic music is the story of the 20th century. It's the story of World War II. It's a story of the Cold War. There's so much wrapped up in this stuff. It is, the more I study it, the more I learn about history in general, about world history and American history. And I also learn about the history of science and technology and, the history of cybernetics, let's say, or the history of satellite technology or the history of the transistor. All of these things have something to do with experimental electronic music in ways that are possibly less obvious some of the time. The history of computing. So these are all interwoven into computer music and electronic music and all of these things.
Well, it's really interesting you say it that way because if you think about it, it seems like any time a new technology is created, one of the first things that people are compelled to do with it is to try and make music with the new technology, right? That seems to be something that is innate. As soon as we get a tool, we try and make a sound with it.
That wasn't always the case, though. I mean, the fact that that is intuitive now, it wasn't intuitive in the 1940s
Right.
or even the 1950s to do those things. Back when computers had the nickname of like a defense calculator, you know, these were giant devices that were tools of the military-industrial complex. It was counterintuitive that you were going to use a machine like that
For art.
to make art or music.
Right.
But people did, and now we take it for granted that you would use your laptop to make music or edit a movie, but that wasn't always the case. That's what I find so inspiring about these people kind of wrestling with these early technologies and trying to push them in new directions.
So I posited that it just seems natural, and you point out that it wasn't always natural. What do you think was the tipping point? Was it someone like Max Matthews at Bell Labs, or was it more someone like Keith Emerson with a great big synthesizer? What do you think was a tipping point for people? Or was it the CD player?
There's not one tipping point in history, obviously. There's going to be many, many, many tipping. I actually don't even like the word tipping point.
Okay.
I think it's. I didn't like the
It's
book.
too singular. It's too singular.
I don't
right.
buy into that. I don't buy into that as a theory. I think, and I also think that we shouldn't look at history as a series of individual figures. As you know, as Brian Eno likes to say, it's the genius. It's not the genius. It's the intelligence of a scene of people, of a crowd of people, that leads to changes in our society more than these individual geniuses. Not to undermine the fact that there were certainly many geniuses working and creating these new technologies or creating new music, but it's about groups of people working together a lot of the time. Most definitely, Max Matthews was, really the modern father of computer music. I mean, he was the one in 1957 who got an IBM 704 to make sound. Max was most definitely a genius, but he worked with a large group of other people who were brilliant people, like John Pierce, who was his boss, and so many other people working at Bell Labs. So he is one of those people that made it, helped us get to the point we're at today, where we just look at a computer and say, yeah, I'm going to use that to make music. I'm going to make a song today on GarageBand or something like that, We take for granted how much power we have at our fingertips now, that I can make a song on my iPhone in my pocket. I have more computing power in my pocket than Bell Labs had in the 1950s.
Right. Obviously, you have an incredible background of studying this stuff. I'm curious about, given the interests that you shared, growing up loving science and engineering and studying that, how did you end up focusing on music as the thing that was going to be what you talked about and what you studied? What was your background that drew you into that?
Well, I always played music as a kid. I studied classical piano very seriously in the conservatory. I played in piano competitions. So I could read music, and I was very interested in music, and I started collecting records at a very young age, too. Probably it was like 10 or 11.
Oh, okay. When
I started collecting music. I'm also of an Indian background, and I learned at a young age about Indian classical music, which opened my ears to a different way of making music outside of Western classical music. And then later on, I got very interested in jazz. I got interested in rock and, all the other kinds of music that people are into. I liked electronic music, all of these things. And so I came into, before I was in college, I already was very immersed in music. And I was never one of those people that was very like one-sided, like, oh, I like science, but I only like science. I was never like that. I liked science, but I also liked music, you know? And so I liked physics, but I also liked writing, you know? And so I always had that side to me where I was interested in the arts just as much as I was interested in science and engineering. And so I just was very immersed in college in music as well. You know, I wrote some music. I took music classes in addition to learning how to write code and biology and physics and math and all the other things I was doing. So, you know, it was just a through line through my whole life. Music, to me, is one of the reasons why people want to live. You know, it is one of the reasons that life is good. It has such a capability to improve your life and to give people hope and to really change culture in many ways. Music is almost, I would say, as important as food, really. And so I don't view music as this non-essential, frilly thing. I view music as a very essential thing to human beings. And so I don't view studying music very differently from studying physics or chemistry. I think it's just, again, you know, one of those essential forces. It's really, to me, it's almost like a natural science. So I think, you know, I have always thought music as being incredibly important.
Now, in one of the articles of yours that I read, it was a discussion of Pete Shelley from the Buzzcocks. You start off the article talking about in the late 1990s microwaving a bunch of your punk CDs so that you could focus on electronic music. Now, in this case, the Buzzcock CDs stayed on your shelf. But in general, it sounds like you made a very conscious decision to focus on electronic music and electronic sound. What was the draw to that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I always loved, like, let's say, I loved the Velvet Underground. You know, they were one of my first favorite bands from when I was like 16 or 17. I loved David Bowie. I liked a lot of rock music, but all of that, I mean, especially with David Bowie, I remember how he had this electronic side to him. You know, when I heard albums like Low, it like blew my mind when I was like 17 or 18. And I think that's the way a lot of people, it opens the floodgates for a lot of people into electronic music. Is that their favorite rock and roll people also experimented quite heavily with electronics. And so you hear that in these albums, classic rock albums by so many people. And then even somebody like Lou Reed using guitar feedback in an album like Metal Machine Music. I mean, that's electronic music, too.
Right.
And even though he was using a guitar, that isn't to say that it isn't electronic sound. And so there's so many ways of getting into electronic music. I mean, I remember I was really into all this stuff that was coming out around 1996. It was like Boards of Canada, Aphex Twin. All the stuff on Warp Records was really hot at that time. And it was hard not to get swept up in it, especially if you were in engineering school. I mean, that stuff just really appealed to you somehow, like stuff like Aphex Twin. If you're already studying science and math, it's just like there was something about that music that really keyed into that stuff. I had friends who built their own synthesizers. I had friends who made their own robots. And so it was natural to be interested in how to make music with engineering. And the early history of electronic music especially is really the history of electrical engineering. Because, you know, at that time, you know, it's all analog electronics and, you know, there's a whole lot you can learn about engineering by studying those old machines. So, I really viewed them as part and parcel of each other. That, I just think it's so important and so compelling, like I said, to study these things. So
Right.
it was just always natural. It wasn't like I am rejecting rock music today and I'm only listening to electronic music. It was more like, wow, this album by David Bowie called Low, like the whole second side sounds like ambient music.
Right.
Who's this Brian Eno guy? This was like when I was 17 or so. And listening to stuff like that, it really opens these new avenues to you. A lot of psychedelic rock or a lot of 70s kind of art rock. A lot of people get into electronic music without knowing it. They listen to a rock record and then they hear a synthesizer on it, or they watch cartoons as a kid, or they watch a science fiction movie. Forbidden Planet, for example, came out in 1956. And to this day, that electronic score by Louis and Bibi Baron is still one of, the most interesting and unique pieces of electronic music ever made. It's like a really, really pioneering electronic sounds.
Yeah, still so influential too. So, no kidding.
Yeah.
You talk about certain inroads coming from rock leading towards electronics, and there's probably nobody that embodies that more than Brian Eno. And you have kind of a very special relationship with Brian Eno in that you wrote the 33 and a third book for Another Green World, which is, I think a lot of people will be like, oh, that's who we're talking to, because I know a lot of people that are into the 33 and a third series anyway, and specifically into that book. So I want to ask you a little bit. First of all, how did you even get the opportunity to write that book? And to what extent was Brian Eno the natural thing for you to write about?
Oh, man, it was so long ago now that I wrote that book. I'd already been working as a journalist for several years when I pitched that book, and, it got accepted very quickly, and I just went through and wrote it. It's all kind of a blur to me now because it just kind of went by so fast. As I write in the introduction of that book, it was a really difficult process. He's not an easy guy to write about, and it was certainly a challenge to write about Brian Eno well. I think I did a good job, though, because, as you said, that book did sell incredibly well. Mm-hmm. Still sells really well.
It does,
10 years later.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to say that it's Brian Eno's favorite book that's been written about him. That's what he's told me. So he really loved the book, and we've been friends for a long time now because of that book.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'll ask you to cast back a little bit. I don't want to obsess about the book, but I do wonder, why is it that you chose that album, Another Green World in particular, versus the many other things that were available roughly at that same time?
Because I felt that it told the best story. 1975 was a huge transition period in Brian Eno's life. He had that now famous accident. He had his sort of epiphany about ambient music. He made 2 albums that year, Another Green World and also Discreet Music, which is another very interesting album. And I thought that this was writing about somebody's turning point and their epiphanies is a great kind of plot line for a book. It seemed natural to choose that one to write about. When you're writing a book, you need pacing and a storyline and character development and all these things that keep people excited and interested in reading. And so you have to structure it, even though it's nonfiction, you sort of structure it like a novel, like a thriller kind of novel where you want to keep turning the page and see what happens next. And so Another Green World lended itself very well to that kind of novelistic sort of structure.
Sure. It does keep you engaged because it's a very experiential story that you tell. But what's interesting to me is that that book isn't the only place I see that. This orientation towards story seems to be kind of part of how you practice the craft of writing. I would say that in my experience of reading through many of your articles, there always seems to be it's not just facts or even a timeline. You tend to focus on story, and you said before that you focus on people more than gear or technologies. And it seems like in the actual craft of the writing, storytelling is just a critical part of how you do your thing. Even if it seems like it ought to be just a fact-based article, you seem to be able to coax out stories.
Yeah, I'm glad you recognize that. Yeah, it's challenging. It's very challenging, especially with more obscure subjects, where the reader doesn't have much background to begin with. You have to really paint a picture for the reader every time. And it can also be challenging if, like let's say the newspaper or the magazine you're writing for doesn't give you that much space. You have fewer words to kind of build up a story for them. So it's always a challenge, but I wouldn't be doing this if it was easy. I do it because it's hard. I enjoy the path of most resistance. I'm not saying it's fun. A lot of the times it's not fun at all.
Yeah.
So writing is totally agonizing most of the time, I would say. I don't actually enjoy writing that much. I enjoy research a lot. Writing can be, as I'm sure you're aware, very agonizing, very nerve-wracking, especially if you're on a tight deadline. And sometimes you're just staring at a blank Microsoft Word screen, just desperate for inspiration. That happens a lot. It happens to everybody.
Sure.
It's just, I've written well over 1,000 articles about music, and every time you look at that blank screen, it's just as hard as it was the first time.
Right.
It's always going to be hard. It's always going to be agonizing. So you just have to, keep yourself inspired. Keep reading. Keep watching movies. I find that movies are an incredible teaching tool because, movies, you get lost in a story, right? In a great film, when the magic of cinema is you get totally swept up into a story. How does that work? So I watch documentaries, I watch dramas, I read lots of books, I read poetry. And through all of those things, you can develop a sense of story, like
Right.
what works, what doesn't work, what tricks can you use to sort of reel the reader in and get them excited about something that can be quite obscure.
That's interesting you say that because that sort of like cinematic hook thing, that's something that you a lot of times do with your articles when you kind of kick off the article. You seem pretty masterful about like catching people's attention and drawing them into paragraph 2. And I can imagine that like crafting anything else has got to be something that you toil over.
Yeah. I mean, I also went to journalism school. I have a master's degree from Columbia Journalism School. And in journalism school is where I learned a lot of that as well. Basically, how to report a story, how to write a story, how to structure a news story. And so, with these articles, you're not writing hard news, but you're writing like in a feature style. And, in journalism, you talk a lot about the lead, how to hook the reader in with the first paragraph or graph, as a journalist would say. And so you spend a long time on the beginning to hook the reader in. And then you have to kind of sustain their interest through the article. Sometimes I find it's easier to just start writing the article from the middle and then write the beginning at the end. Because if you spend too long agonizing about having like the absolute most perfect opening line, like you're never going to start.
Right.
So
Sure.
it's better to just get to the meat of the story, like write a rough draft, and then hopefully like the genius opening line will come to you while you're working.
Yeah, while you're embedded in it, right? Now,
Yeah.
earlier you taught one of the things that's interesting to me though too is that not only are you doing articles that entertain, but you're also doing articles that are very informative. They're kind of like thick with detail and thick with sort of like structural meat, right? And
Yeah.
I'm curious. You talked before about the research that you do, doing deep research, finding the non-obvious source material or the less known interview or whatever. What's a good example of digging deep to find something surprising? Do you have like an example that would be illustrative of that kind of situation?
Oh man, so many examples. Literally I would find the ancestors of, like, let's say a composer who died 30 years ago. You'd find their living family members and you would interview them about their memories of that person. I've been led to all kinds of tips. There's tapes in this garage, or there's, in this desk drawer, there is a copy of a certificate from 1954. Like things like that, where it really is like you're a private eye. You're not just a journalist. You're like a detective putting together a story. So it really becomes like, like it's an Agatha Christie novel or something. It's another trick that I'll use is finding really rare films. So like maybe like short films that nobody has. They're not on YouTube. See, like somebody who's lazy, like this is what happens a lot on the internet. You'll see like a lot of writers just all repeating each other.
Right.
They're all writing about the same thing when it happens.
They're using each other as sources, right?
Yeah, the same press release, or they're all copying each other. And they're under immense time pressure to get it done as fast as possible. They're maybe spending an hour writing it. And so they just do a quick Google search, and then they maybe search on YouTube and they find some interesting clips. I'm not knocking YouTube. There's a lot of really rare stuff on YouTube.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go down such a wormhole with YouTube where you just can't come out of it. Believe me, I've been there. But there's so much outside of YouTube. There are things that have never been digitized. That exist in private collections. You might find somebody who has just like a fuzzy VHS tape or a reel of 16 millimeter film that has some priceless footage on it. And those are very exciting moments. I've had a few of those moments in my own work. Another great resource is liner notes off of a very old, rare album. Liner notes are a great source of information that is sadly being lost now because as everything's moving to streaming like Spotify and Apple Music and these services, you're losing your liner notes. You're losing all the production notes, and all that stuff is priceless information. You have a lot of magazines that don't exist anymore, magazines that have long gone out of print. So I've spent an inordinate amount of time on eBay and various things like buying rare old magazines that haven't been scanned in yet. I have very rare books that I've paid hundreds of dollars for that don't exist online. So you're piecing together from a lot of very analog sources. Not everything's on the internet. Not everything is available from a 2-minute Google search. I still go to the library. I still find stuff. I'll track stuff down at various university libraries around the world. There's a lot of ways to find stuff. You just have to have the grit and the wherewithal to find it. If you have that motivation, it's just the problem is a lot of people are either lazy or they're pressed for time. And, they're not willing to do that. I mean, even if I have a really tight deadline, I mean, I had 6 hours to write an obituary for Glenn Branca for The Guardian, and I still interviewed like 5 or 6 people. I was up all night calling people on the phone because I'm not willing to put out anything with my name on it that I don't think is good. That's really what it comes down to. Is like, I'm a bit of a perfectionist for sure. And the longer you do this work and the longer that people get to know you a bit, it's just, I won't put my name on anything that I won't stand behind. And so I have a very high standard for the stuff that I'm willing to write,
Sure. How hard is it though then to do work for the variety of magazines you do? Because I'll tell you, on one hand, you write stuff for The Wire, who's going to embrace pretty much whatever craziness you want to pull together. But then your next article will be like for an online piece for NPR. The NPR audience isn't going to know this kind of background references that a Wire reader might. How do you change your motor in order to do that excellence of work in some crazily different environments?
Yeah, I mean, this year marks the 15 years of me writing for The Wire, which is a long time.
Yeah.
I started writing for The Wire 15 years ago, and, they're a great magazine. I'm glad they're still around. But you're right. There is a lot of stuff that I can get away with writing in The Wire, because I'm writing generally for an audience in The Wire of people who are very immersed in experimental music. A lot of them are musicians themselves. And that's a very different audience from writing for, as you said, a place like NPR, or if I write for The Guardian or
Right.
Wired or something like that. What I always try to do is I always try to treat the reader like they're smart. I never try to treat the reader like they're dumb. And it really maddens me that a lot of writing you see in a lot of mainstream magazines these days is really lowest common denominator stuff. I mean, it's like they're literally treating their audience almost with contempt, like they're these lemmings
Right.
that can just be led around.
Right.
And talking down to them or doing these really kind of cheesy articles that don't have any real substance to them. Like, no, the reader's smart. I start with the assumption that readers are intelligent. They're smart. They want to push their minds in interesting directions. They want to learn new things. So you start with that first assumption. So even if you're writing for a very mainstream place, you're still writing something intelligent, that has substance, that has depth. You're just not using any special terms, specific musical terminology.
Right.
So basically, you just try not to use any $10 words, which you really shouldn't use anyway. You're not writing a musicology textbook. You're
Right.
writing for a general audience. So you use words that anybody would understand. And, it's very challenging. It's always a challenge to explain something really complicated in easy to understand words. Like I always say that, a 12-year-old should be able to understand an article that I write. Your mother, who's 70 years old, should be able to understand an article that I write. So it's everything I write is designed to appeal to the widest group of people possible. Another way that I learned how to write in a way that was accessible is because I worked as a teacher. So I was a student teacher in high school.
Okay.
And I taught several classes as a teacher. And having to teach high school students, I used to teach math. You really start from first principles. You're like, okay, look, algebra and trigonometry is really not that hard. That's what I start out with. It's only hard because people tell you that it's hard. You guys are psyching yourselves out. You think calculus is hard because people tell you calculus is hard. Let me tell you, calculus is actually easy. So that's what I would say on the first day of class. And I would say, just calculus is actually easy, trigonometry is easy, and we're just going to start with really basic stuff, and I'm going to show you why this stuff's actually easy. So, like, people can learn anything if it's presented in a way where it's not condescending, where it's not too complicated. You can teach somebody anything.
Right.
You know, you can teach them high-level nuclear physics. It's just that people really get scared. They think that, oh, this must be so hard. And a lot of times your teachers, some of them are really good and some of them might not be so good at explaining things to you. You know, when I'm trying to explain something complicated, I'm like, look, like, let's break it down. Like, how does this work? I want, by the end of an article that I write, I want you to feel like you're a little bit smarter, you know, that you know a little bit more than you did when you began the article. You know, that's my goal every time. And I want that to be really subtle. I want that to happen in your head, you know, where, oh, okay, no, I get that now. I never want it to feel like it's a lesson or I'm talking down to you or I'm telling you what to do. I never want it to feel that way. I want it to organically feel like you discovered it. Mm-hmm. That's what really great teaching is about. A great teacher is going to make you feel like you discovered the answer to the math problem yourself.
Right, so true.
So a great journalist, a great writer is the same thing as being a really good teacher. It's exactly the same set of skills as being a really good teacher. It's just you're teaching somebody something and you want to make them feel like they figured it out themselves. With every incremental article that they read by me, if they read, like, let's say, you know, I know people who have read hundreds of articles that I've written, and they tell me that they've actually accumulated like a body of knowledge about experimental music because they've read some of the things I've written,
right. Based
which
on
is
that,
great.
Right. Yep.
That's exactly what I'm aiming for, that this is basically like a free class. It's just like free training in learning about experimental sound. That's what I'm aiming for this whole time, is that it's non-threatening, non-condescending, you know, just you don't have homework to do at night, you know, you don't have a big tuition bill to pay at the end of the semester or any of that. It's just like, basically, it's like a bunch of structured lessons where you're learning stuff about music every time you read an article that I write. That's what I'm always aiming for.
Well, that's really incredible. Unfortunately, our time is just about up. But before I let you go, when we started this discussion talking about sort of journalism in the way that you do it being kind of under siege, right? What do you imagine is a way for us to get out of it? I think nobody's going to be able to reel back the internet, but what is a mechanism that I think everyone that listens to this podcast is going to be interested in preserving the kind of work that you do. The question is, how can we build an environment where that is viable?
I mean, the number one best way to support the work that I do is by supporting me on Patreon. I think Patreon is an incredible tool to support individual writers or artists that you really, really like. That way you make sure the money is going directly to them, and Patreon takes a very small cut, so almost all of it goes to the artist or to the writer. So I would say that's the number one best way. I think that you can check out my Patreon. It's at patreon.com/Geeta Dayal. If people go there and they just kick in $1 a month, $2 a month, $5 a month, if they have more capability, then more than that is always very much appreciated. That's like the best way to make sure that this work continues on. That is the most promising way forward for journalists, particularly people like me who focus on the arts or more obscure subject matter, because these magazines are all collapsing left and right. I mean, The Village Voice, where I got my start, doesn't exist anymore. And it's shocking and it's terrible. And, you know, it's just, there's a lot fewer ways to make money off this stuff. So, fortunately, I write for a lot of art publications now. 4 columns in particular has been phenomenal. They're an incredible source for criticism now. I write for them regularly about experimental music. Every couple of weeks, I write a long essay for 4 columns, and they're funded via the art world. I write for Freeze. I've written for Art Forum. I write for a lot of art publications these days. You know, journalists have to get really creative. Like, if you write about music, don't just write for music magazines. Like, figure out what other kinds of magazines you could write for. And so you have to constantly be reinventing yourself, constantly be inventive, be creative. And then, I feel like every writer these days should start Patreon, because it's just getting worse. I mean, the state of criticism in America, the state of journalism, unfortunately, because of the growth of the way of the internet, which has been great in so many ways, it's just, it's fostered this environment where you can basically grab anything you want for free. And so you can grab the music you want for free. You can grab like a really long, well thought out article about something, but like actual human labor went into those things. So when you grab a song for free, or you grab a long piece of writing for free, I mean, somebody put a lot of thinking and effort into those things, and it's effort that should be paid for. And so if we can't put the genie back into the bottle with the internet, where I don't think we're ever going to be able to get to a point where everybody is paying $1 for every article they read or whatever. I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Right.
I think the next best thing is, like I said, to support individual writers that you really like through Patreon. I just really think that that's the only way to ensure that the writers you like will survive for the next generation.
Indeed. Well, Geeta, I want to thank you so much for spending the time with us. For people who want to check out your work, theoriginalsoundtrack.com. What a great URL. Nice pickup there. Theoriginalsoundtrack.com is where all your work is. People can can jump over to your Patreon from there if they want. Otherwise, you said it's
patreon.com/Geeta Dayal, GeetaDayal.
All right, fantastic.
I also have a new book coming out. It's a collection of my writings on experimental music over the last 20 years. So
that's fantastic.
Stay tuned for that.
All right.
So it'll be like a 300-page or longer anthology of like what I consider kind of my greatest hits or my best essays, and interviews as well with lots of musicians. And so that way it's all collected into a single volume instead of having to search all across the internet for all these different things.
That's fantastic. Great news there. Well, I want to thank you so much again, and I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Let me know when it's posted.
All right,
Thanks
I'll
so
do
much.
it. All right, bye.
All right, bye.
Many thanks to Geeta for that great interview. There's some important stuff there, and I think we all need to be cognizant of journalism and its importance to us as fans of interesting stuff. So if you have an opportunity, make sure you go and visit her site. Check out her Patreon. If you've got a couple of bucks to spare, I think that would be a great way to spend it. A couple of things too. I just want to add a couple of notes. First of all, I have become a big fan of 1010 Music's gear. The Bitbox and the Toolbox have become like really important parts of my work. The people at 1010 are great, and if you have an opportunity, go check out their gear. It's really worth it. The other thing is, this week I got a very cool zine in the mail. It's called Deft Esoterica, and it's a great kind of, it's a zine in the great tradition of zines. If you're interested and you are curious about what they've got going on, you can check it out. It's at deftesoterica.bandcamp.com. You can check the website for the show if you want a link to click on. Otherwise, deftesoterica.bandcamp.com will get you there. Thanks to everybody for continuing to listen. Thanks to all of the people who have been sending me email, sending me names of people they'd like to hear. I'm following through on a lot of them. We have a lot of great interviews coming up. With that, I'm going to let you go. Have a good one. Bye.